Imagine a world where flavor didn't exist, where food was bland, monotonous, lifeless. Now imagine that in this same world, a single mineral could transform taste, preserve food, sustain entire armies, define empires, create massive trade routes, and, above all, function as money. This is the story of salt. Not just a seasoning, but perhaps the most powerful, influential, and coveted substance in human history. A substance that controlled peoples, determined wars, sustained civilizations, and, for many centuries, was worth more than gold itself. When we talk about wealth, we think of gold, silver, oil, diamonds. But for much of human history, none of these riches came close to the strategic value of salt. Salt was life. Salt was power. Salt was survival. And in an era when the world was far more vulnerable, fragile, and dependent on nature, this small white substance became the foundation of the global economy. If we could travel thousands of years into the past, we'd see entire peoples living around salt mines. We'd see immense caravans crossing deserts carrying solid blocks of salt as if they were gold bars. We'd see cities emerging around salt springs. We'd see empires levying heavy taxes on every grain of this precious mineral. We'd see battles fought to seize control of regions where salt naturally emerged from the earth. And we'd see, above all, people treating salt not as a seasoning, but as a true treasure, something as valuable as survival itself. The importance of salt is so ancient it intertwines with human history, from civilization's first steps. Even before cities, even before developed agriculture, peoples were already fighting over natural salt sources to ensure their animal survival and food preservation. There were no refrigerators, no modern storage, and without salt, all food perished quickly. Without salt, there was no meat stock, no winter reserves, no food security. Governments knew this, and whoever controlled salt controlled society. One of the most striking examples of this invisible force lies in ancient Rome. The most powerful empire of antiquity had roads, armies, culture, wealth, but none of it would be possible without salt. Roman soldiers literally received part of their payment in salt. From this came the word salary, salarium, payment in salt. And from this concept comes another expression, worth your salt, used to this day to measure someone's value. Because in that ancient world, being paid in salt meant being paid in something of real value, something that sustained families, armies, and cities. But Rome wasn't the only civilization dominated by this seemingly simple substance. In West Africa, gigantic caravans transported blocks of salt across the Sahara Desert. These blocks were so valuable that people cut them like precious bars. In some regions, salt was literally traded for gold in equivalent proportions. That is, a bar of salt was worth a bar of gold. And this wasn't for luxury, but for necessity. Gold was beautiful, shiny, a symbol of power. Salt, on the other hand, sustained lives. In the most ancient human logic, salt was worth far more. In China, for centuries, governments built entire fortunes by taxing salt. The state monopoly on salt-financed dynasties strengthened borders, paid armies, and sustained imperial bureaucracy. In medieval Europe, salt was so expensive that entire populations lived in debt just to preserve food for winter. Rich cities emerged simply because they were located near mines or saline rivers. Venice, one of the most powerful cities of the Middle Ages, built its wealth on the salt trade. Nothing, absolutely nothing, fueled Europe's commercial growth as much as this mineral. But the most fascinating thing is that the history of salt isn't just economic. It's also political, social, and even revolutionary. The famous gabelle, the French salt tax, was one of the causes of discontent that inflamed the French Revolution. Imagine living in a country where even the salt you consume daily is taxed to the point of becoming inaccessible. That's how it was in pre-revolutionary France. Salt was a symbol of state oppression, and when the population finally rose against the government, ending this tax was one of the most urgent demands. Elsewhere, salt was a protagonist of freedom movements. In India, Mahatma Gandhi challenged the British Empire by marching to the sea to produce salt. The famous Salt March in 1930 was one of the most symbolic events in the struggle for independence. Salt, once again, was more than a seasoning. It was resistance, freedom, dignity. For all these reasons, when we look at salt's history, we realize this simple mineral connects empires, wars, revolutions, economies, and human survival. It didn't just season food, it seasoned history. And for a long time, its value surpassed all traditional riches. In a world without technology, without refrigeration, without fast transportation, salt was the difference between living and dying. And this deeply visceral importance transformed salt into the most powerful currency that ever existed. But to truly understand why salt became humanity's most desired currency, we need to delve deeper into its presence in ancient people's daily lives. In a world without electricity, without refrigerators, without industrial packaging, and without fast trade routes, food preservation was a deadly challenge. Meat spoiled quickly, fish rotted in hours, milk turned sour. Even entire harvests could be lost without adequate methods. And then enters salt, the only resource capable of preventing food from becoming poison. With salt, peoples could store food for winter, for long journeys, for military sieges, for unexpected storms. With salt, a starving army could be fed. Without it, an entire civilization could disappear. Therefore, salt was essential not just as wealth, but as strategy. Entire kingdoms made military calculations based on access to or blockade of salt routes. A commander could be defeated not on the battlefield, but the moment his salt reserves ran out. Many wars were won because one side managed to cut off the enemy's salt supply, and this invisible weapon decided fates as powerfully as swords and walls. Even in everyday life, salt played a role beyond cooking. It preserved food, yes, but also preserved hides, healed wounds, helped with hygiene, served as a purifying agent, and even symbolized spiritual alliances. In many ancient rituals, salt was seen as a sacred element, capable of warding off evil and protecting families. It was common for peoples to carry small bags of salt to symbolize protection and prosperity. And in some cultures, offering salt was a gesture of peace and deep friendship. But what truly elevated salt to universal currency status was its relative scarcity. Unlike today, when salt is available in any supermarket for pennies, in the past it was extremely difficult to extract. Mining salt required brutal physical effort. Transporting it was dangerous, especially in desert regions. Producing it by evaporating seawater required specific conditions and enormous work areas. Therefore, whoever controlled these regions automatically controlled the flow of wealth. One of the most impressive examples of this dynamic is the city of Timbuktu in Mali. Located in the heart of the Sahara, Timbuktu became one of the richest cities in the medieval world thanks to the salt trade. Giant caravans with thousands of camels crossed the desert for weeks to bring salt blocks south and trade them for gold. It was an extremely dangerous journey, full of sandstorms, deadly heat, and unexpected attacks. But it was worth it, because the salt that crossed the desert was worth as much as gold, sometimes even more. Another fascinating scene comes from Mediterranean salt flats, where workers spent entire days under the hot sun scraping salt crystals that appeared on the surface of evaporated water. It was hard, repetitive work, but essential. Entire cities depended on this effort. Some of them, like Aveiro, Venice, and ancient Greek cities, built fortunes on these salt flats. And it wasn't abstract wealth. It was concrete, visible wealth, sustained by trade in something indispensable for human life. And then we arrive at the most curious point. In many places, salt was literally used as money. Salt blocks with specific measurements had fixed values and could be directly exchanged for food, clothes, tools, livestock, and even slaves. In certain regions, a salt block could buy a horse. In others, 2 bars could buy a house. Salt had intrinsic value, real value, because it carried utility, necessity, and scarcity. But, as happens with all strong currencies, salt was also subject to corruption, counterfeiting, and political control. Governments created monopolies to artificially raise prices. Merchants mixed impurities to increase weight. Armies seized salt deposits as if they were looting banks. And entire populations lived in fear of running out of this fundamental resource. Even today, it's hard to imagine that something so common for us was once so strategic. But we just need to look at modern history to realize this hasn't changed that much. Oil, for example, is a salt of the industrial era, something indispensable that defines economies, wars, and alliances. Similarly, Lithium is a salt of the digital age, an essential mineral for technology that today drives geopolitical disputes. In other words, the logic hasn't changed, only the resources have. The interests are the same. Salt also shaped the most important trade routes of antiquity. The Via Salaria in Rome was one of the world's first great roads and influenced the empire's expansion. The salt route in the Sahara connected North and South Africa for centuries. China's salt ports connected the East to the rest of Asia. Salt crossed continents even before silk and spices. It was the first great global commodity. Before any gold, before any standardized currency, before any metallic coins. And then we arrive at a fascinating point in history, the moment when salt began losing value. From the 19th century onward, with the arrival of new technologies, mining machines, and industrial production methods, salt went from precious resource to common product. It became abundant, accessible, and cheap. Its value dropped dramatically. The mineral that once was worth more than gold, that sustained empires, that moved wars and defined civilizations, finally lost its throne. But its impact remained forever engraved in human history. Salt no longer holds its former value, but it continues to carry deep symbolism of preservation, purity, and prosperity. For centuries, it shaped cultures, rituals, and entire economies, moving armies, caravans, and empires. It was history's most solid currency, valuable not by trust, but by human necessity. Even trivialized today, its legacy remains. Without salt, no civilization would have survived.